1,000 years, of kings and crusaders, of plagues and cathedrals of faith and fire. You'll see how a world collapsed and another slowly rose from its ashes, how knights, monks, and merchants built the foundations of our modern world. And by the end, you might realize the Middle Ages weren't dark at all. They were the spark that lit the modern age. So, if you're ready, grab a cup of tea, sit back, and let's journey through one of history's most misunderstood eras. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy deep dives into world history, because tonight we're rewriting what you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. A great empire had fallen, and Europe now stood between two worlds, one that had collapsed and one not yet born. 476 AD. The Western Roman Empire, the vast political machine that had once imposed roads laws, calendars, and a shared sense of order across Europe, collapsed. Not with a single explosion, but with a long, exhausted sigh. Rome, the city that had named itself Urbs Aeterna, the Eternal City, was sacked. Its marble forums echoed with foreign footsteps. Its golden domes were blackened by smoke. Statues that had stood for centuries were broken, melted, or simply abandoned to time. To those who lived through it, this did not feel like the beginning of a new era. It felt like the end of the world they knew. No one standing amid the ruins could have known that history had just turned a page. No proclamation announced it. No bell rang to mark the hour. And yet in that moment of fragmentation and fear, a new chapter of human history quietly opened what we would later call the Middle Ages. For the people of the 5th century, there was no such term. There was only uncertainty. Imperial authority evaporated almost overnight. Armies disbanded, trade routes withered, cities that had relied on grain shipments from distant provinces shrank or emptied. Literacy, once sustained by Roman administration, began to retreat into small pockets. The world did not plunge instantly into darkness, but the lights flickered one by one. What followed was not a sudden fall into chaos, but a long unmooring. Roman law no longer reached the countryside. Coins disappeared from circulation. Stone roads cracked without maintenance. Public baths fell silent. The rhythms that had ordered daily life for generations dissolved, leaving communities to improvise new ways of surviving in a world without a center. Centuries later, scholars would try to name this vast, unsettling interval. Media tempestas, the space between two worlds. The term media tempestas first appeared in 1469, coined by Renaissance scholars who believed they were awakening from a long sleep. In Latin, it means the time in between. In their eyes, it was the space between two brilliance-filled horizons, the classical splendor of Rome behind them, and the reborn confidence of their own age ahead, an age of artists, architects, and thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, whose works would soon fill the streets and workshops of Florence. To these Renaissance thinkers, the centuries in between felt like an interruption, a pause in human greatness. They imagined antiquity as a golden dawn, their own era, as a second sunrise, and everything between as a long, dim twilight. The Middle Ages were framed not as a world in their own right, but as a corridor one hurried through on the way to something better. And yet this idea tells us more about Renaissance pride than about medieval reality. The so-called time in between was not empty. It was crowded with lives, with fear and faith, with fragile experiments in rebuilding order from the ground up. While emperors vanished, monasteries quietly preserved books. While cities shrank, villages learned to endure. While grand marble architecture crumbled, new forms of beauty emerged in woodsong ritual and belief. From the perspective of those who lived within it, there was no sense of being between anything. They were not waiting for the Renaissance. They were not mourning Rome every day. They were planting crops, raising children, praying for protection, and trying to make sense of a world where the old guarantees no longer applied. What we call the Middle Ages was in truth a laboratory of survival. It was an age where human beings learned how to live without the illusion of permanence, where power fractured into local forms, where identity shifted from empire to faith, from citizenship to belonging, where meaning was no longer anchored in monuments of stone, but in story symbols, and the promise that history, though broken, was not abandoned. So when we say media tempestas, the space between, we should pause. Between does not mean empty. Between does not mean meaningless. Between is often where transformation begins. The fall of Rome did not extinguish civilization. It forced it to change shape. And in that long night between antiquity and modernity, humanity did not forget how to think, to believe, or to create. It learned slowly, painfully, how to carry light without the shelter of empire. That is where the Middle Ages truly begin. But here lies the irony. The people who lived through that so-called Middle Age never believed they were in between anything. They only knew that the world around them had changed. Roman stone roads, once measured, paved, and guarded by imperial decree, were now slowly swallowed by grass and roots. The straight lines that had bound provinces together softened under rain and neglect. Milestones cracked, bridges sagged. What had once been designed to last forever began to return patiently to the earth, not through violence, but through forgetting. Statues of gods lay broken where they had fallen. Marble faces lost their noses. Limbs separated from torsos. Some were toppled deliberately, others simply abandoned when no one remembered their names. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, figures that had once embodied cosmic order and civic virtue, became anonymous stone. Yet in the quiet that followed, another sound rose. Not the trumpet of legions, but the steady toll of church bells, simple at first, local, human, calling not to empire, but to gathering. An old order was dissolving not in flames alone, but in habits, assumptions, and expectations. The world no longer promised stability through law citizenship or Rome's eternal protection. In its place, a new faith was slowly taking shape. Christianity did not arrive as a sudden replacement, but as a thread woven gradually into daily life. It offered meaning where institutions had failed. It spoke of suffering not as disgrace, but as participation in a larger story. In a world where nothing felt permanent anymore, it spoke of eternity, not in stone, but in the soul. Later scholars would give this era a name, the Dark Ages. But dark for whom? Dark for those who lost their empire, those who had lived by the certainty of Roman order, Roman roads, Roman taxes, Roman law, or dark for those who for the first time were no longer living under a shadow, cast by distant emperors and unreachable capitals, for peasants who no longer fed cities they would never see. For villages that learned to rely on one another when imperial systems collapsed. For communities that found meaning not in marble forums, but in shared ritual, shared fear, and shared hope. Darkness is always a relative word. It depends on where one stands. For the Roman aristocrat watching estates crumble, the age felt like a descent. For the monk copying texts by candlelight, it felt like preservation. For the farmer tying faith to the rhythm of seasons rather than imperial calendars, it felt like continuity. For a child born into this world, Rome was not a fallen glory. It was a distant rumor. What we call dark was often simply quieter, less monumental, less centralized. Power no longer spoke with one voice. Knowledge no longer traveled on imperial roads, but life did not stop. It adapted, it condensed, it turned inward. The fall of Rome was not the death of civilization. It was the end of a particular way of imagining permanence. Stone could fall, cities could empty, gods could break, but meaning proved more resilient. It moved into stories, prayers, monasteries, and memories passed from mouth to ear rather than carved in marble. So, when we speak of the fall of Rome, we are not describing a single moment of ruin. We are describing a long twilight one in which the old light faded slowly and new light, smaller but steadier, began to appear. Not blazing like empire, but enduring precisely because they belonged to people who no longer expected the world to be held together for them. And perhaps that is why this age still speaks to us. Because it reminds us that when great structures collapse, humanity does not vanish with them. It learns often painfully how to carry light in its own hands. Imagine living in 5th century Europe. From the hilltop fortresses, you see vast forests stretching northward, where barbarian tribes march south. Rome is no longer the Rome of emperors. Civil wars, plagues, taxation, and endless invasions had worn down every brick of the empire. In the 3rd century, a new emperor rose almost every year, most ruled for mere months. Rome's borders buckled under Goths, Huns, and countless northern tribes. In 410, the Visigoths stormed and looted the Eternal City. That shock felt like a divine verdict. The old age was dead. Yet Rome did not fall in a single night. It was a century-long unraveling foreign generals, commanding Roman legions laws, losing authority, faith, shifting foundations. In 395, the empire was split in two. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople still strong, and the Western Empire in Rome already crumbling. When Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, no one realized a 1,000-year chapter had ended, and another 1,000-year chapter had just begun. The bridge between two eras, after Rome, Europe shattered into hundreds of small kingdoms and fiefs. Foreign troops once hired to defend the frontier, called foederati, became masters of the very lands they were paid to guard. The old order vanished, yet not all was lost. Rome's legacy, its language, architecture, and law continued to flow quietly through the continent's veins. Germanic tribes learned to write in Latin. Monks copied ancient texts in candlelit monasteries, preserving knowledge through the long night. Upon these ruins rose a new social order, feudalism. A world of lords and vassal serfs and stone castles of absolute faith in God and in the sword. While trade in cities declined, the Christian church grew as the only remaining light, not just the light of worship, but the light of learning itself. From Rome's ashes, Europe did not die. It merely learned to breathe again, more slowly, but more enduringly. The so-called Dark Ages. From the 15th century onward, Italian Renaissance scholars, adoring the classical past, looked backward and called the intervening era the Dark Ages. To them, everything between Rome and their own time was decay, impoverished art, stagnant science, blind superstition. Yet if we look closer, we see something else entirely. This was the first age in which people discovered the strength of faith community and survival. Peasants rose at dawn to the church bell, plowing lands they did not own, yet still singing. Monks copied Aristotle and Cicero by handline after line in silence. Knights trained not only to fight, but to defend honor, loyalty, and a vision of justice. If anything was truly born in the dark, it was the spirit of modern Europe itself. Why the Middle Ages have no exact beginning or end? Because history does not turn in a single instant, it shifts over centuries. Some say it ended in 1453, when Constantinople, the last Roman bastion, fell to the Ottomans. Others point to 1492, when Columbus reached the Americas and Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, surrendered. For England, it ended in 1485, with Richard III's death at Bosworth, closing the medieval age and ushering in the Tudors. For Spain, perhaps 1504, when Queen Isabella died, and the world's maps turned new colors. Yet whatever date one chooses, they all trace back to 476, the fall of Rome, the moment that began a 1,000-year search for light. Early high and late three, heartbeats of an age. Historians later divided the Middle Ages into three rhythms. Early Middle Ages, 476 to 1000, the age of migrations, feudal lords, and the rising church. High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300, the age of knights, castles, and crusades. Late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, the age of plague war and the first sparks of discovery. Each phase was a heartbeat from faint to strong of Europe's growing soul. 1,000 years not as one long night, but as a slow unfolding dawn. Legacy. Today, when we walk beneath a Gothic cathedral and see stained glass light dance across the stone, we are witnessing the hands of medieval builders. When we speak of universities, nations, or justice, we echo their inventions. They had no electricity, no internet, no dazzling science to measure the stars, but they had something every civilization must possess to endure, the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The 2nd century AD. Under the reign of Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Desert, from the Pyrenees to the Danube. It was the height of civilization, where Rhodes law architecture and the army formed the most perfect machine the world had ever known. Historians call this era Pax Romana, the Roman peace, nearly 2 centuries of prosperity. But every peace has its limit. Behind the marble statues and radiant forums, the first cracks began to appear. Emperors came and went, yet the true power lay in the hands of the army. Population declined, agriculture faltered, and along the northern frontiers, where Goths, Huns, and dozens of so-called barbarian tribes lived, movement began. A cold wind was blowing down from the north, and no one could stop it. The crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire consumed itself. In the year 235, when Emperor Severus Alexander was cut down not by foreign enemies, but by his own soldiers, something fundamental inside Rome finally broke. The murder itself was not unprecedented. Roman emperors had long lived with the knowledge that power was fragile, but this time the act did not close a chapter. It opened a wound that refused to heal. What followed was not a single collapse, but a prolonged fever, an age later remembered as the crisis of the 3rd century. For nearly 50 years, Rome ceased to feel like an empire and began to feel like a battlefield turned inward. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Generals proclaimed themselves rulers in distant provinces. Legions pledged loyalty not to Rome, but to the man who paid them. More than 20 emperors claimed the throne in half a century, and most of them met the same end, betrayed, executed, or struck down by the very armies meant to defend them. Power no longer flowed from legitimacy or law, but from force, fear, and opportunity. Civil war became the empire's constant background noise. Armies marched not against invaders, but against each other. The treasury was drained to fund endless campaigns that produced no lasting victory. Coins were debased, mixed with cheaper metals, until money itself lost credibility. Trade routes fractured as insecurity spread. merchants stopped traveling long distances. Markets emptied. Cities that had once thrived on commerce and administration began to contract, their forums quieter, their baths colder, their streets less maintained with each passing year. As if political chaos were not enough, nature itself seemed to turn against Rome. Plague swept through the provinces, carried along the same roads that once symbolized imperial unity. Entire towns lost large portions of their population. Farms were abandoned. Fields went untilled. Tax bases collapsed as quickly as confidence. In many regions, death became so common that it lost its drama. It was simply expected. This was no longer the Rome of Augustus, the Rome that believed in eternal order, rational administration, and divine favor. It was something else entirely, a giant body still standing, still powerful in appearance, but decaying from within. The structures remained the legions, the laws, the titles, but their inner coherence was gone. Rome had not yet fallen, but it no longer felt inevitable. And while the empire exhausted itself, fighting its own reflection, the world beyond its borders was changing. To the east, the Sasanian Persians replaced the older Parthian state with a far more centralized and aggressive power. They were not raiders. They were rivals organized, ideological, and ambitious. They captured Roman emperors, humiliated legions, and challenged Rome not just militarily, but symbolically, presenting themselves as heirs to an ancient imperial tradition of their own. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed closer, not as a single invading mass, but as many groups responding to pressure, opportunity, and Rome's visible weakness. Some sought plunder, others sought land. Some even sought admission into the empire itself, sensing that Rome no longer had the strength to exclude them outright. Further still, on the horizon of fear, rumors began to circulate of mounted peoples from the Eurasian steppes, the Huns, whose mobility and brutality would later redefine warfare itself. At this stage, they were shadows more than enemies, but shadows that moved fast and unsettled everything in their path. Rome, once the predator of the Mediterranean world, now found itself surrounded. Not attacked all at once, but watched, tested, probed. Like lions circling an aging prey, these emerging powers did not need to rush. They could afford patience. Rome was weakening on its own. The tragedy of the crisis of the 3rd century is not simply that Rome nearly collapsed, but that it survived in a diminished, altered form. Emergency reforms stabilized the empire. New emperors restored borders. The worst passed, but something essential had changed forever. The illusion of permanence was gone. From this point on, Rome would live with the knowledge that it could fail. And once an empire learns that it never rules the same way again, the cross and the new capital. In 312, out of the smoke of civil war, a man named Constantine emerged, carrying a new symbol, the cross. He became the first emperor to recognize Christianity and made it the official religion of the empire. Rome, once a world of gods and gladiators, now draped itself in prayer and ritual. To many, it was a mark of progress. To others, it was the first sign of irreversible change, a shift from the power of the sword to the power of faith. Constantine moved the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople, a city standing between two continents, Asia and Europe, between the old and the new. Rome, the symbol of the past, began to fade into memory. And as Rome waned, the West lost its heart. The barbarians at the gates, beyond the borders of the empire, the Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and many others whose names would later echo through medieval chronicles, were no longer the vague, distant figures of Roman imagination. They were not wandering savages, drifting aimlessly through forests as older Roman stereotypes had portrayed them. They were communities shaped by long contact with Rome itself. For generations, they had traded with Roman merchants, served as mercenaries in Roman armies, and watched the empire closely from just beyond its walls. They learned how Rome fought. They learned how Rome governed. They learned how Rome wrote its laws and kept its records. Many Germanic warriors carried Roman swords and shields. Some wore Roman armor stripped from fallen soldiers or acquired through service. Chieftains learned to negotiate in Latin, to draft treaties to demand subsidies. Entire groups began to understand the rhythms of imperial politics better than Rome itself understood them. The frontier was no longer a sharp line separating civilization from chaos. It had become a zone of exchange imitation and slow transformation. But what these peoples wanted was not Roman philosophy nor Roman citizenship in the abstract. What they desired was simpler and more urgent land security and survival. The northern climate was unforgiving. Short growing seasons, harsh winters, and unpredictable weather ruined harvests with frightening regularity. Famine was not an occasional disaster, it was a recurring threat. At the same time, populations grew. Tribal confederations expanded. Pressure mounted not only from hunger, but from other migrating groups pushing from further east, creating a chain reaction of displacement that no single tribe controlled. Under these conditions, remaining still was often more dangerous than moving. So entire communities began to migrate, not as raiding parties, but as families. Men, women, children, elders, livestock and possessions, sacred objects and ancestral memories. They moved toward the Roman frontiers because those lands were fertile, cultivated, and most importantly, inside an empire that still possessed roads, cities, and food stores. To the people on the move, Rome was not just a target. It was a refuge. The Rhine and the Danube, long celebrated as Rome's natural defensive boundaries, suddenly revealed their fragility. Rivers can be crossed. Forts can be overwhelmed. Garrisons can be bribed, starved, or simply abandoned. As Roman authority weakened, border controls became inconsistent. Some groups were allowed in as federati allies settled on Roman land in exchange for military service. Others forced their way across when negotiation failed. The Romans called them barbarians, a word meant to signal otherness, a word that reduced complex societies into a single sound of foreign speech. But to themselves, they were not barbarians. They were people responding to catastrophe, farmers whose fields no longer fed them, families fleeing violence unleashed by movements they did not initiate, leaders trying to keep their communities alive in a world that was shifting faster than tradition could explain. This difference in perspective mattered. Rome saw invasion. They saw migration. Rome saw chaos. They saw necessity. The tragedy lay in the misunderstanding. Roman institutions built to manage taxation and conquest were ill-equipped to absorb mass movement on such a scale. The empire could conquer territories, but it struggled to integrate entire peoples. When systems failed, fear took over. Fear hardened into hostility. Hostility escalated into violence. And yet, even as Roman officials denounced the newcomers, Rome continued to rely on them. Germanic soldiers filled the ranks of the legions. Germanic generals commanded Roman armies. Germanic kings negotiated directly with emperors. The empire was no longer merely defending itself from outsiders. It was being reshaped from within by the very people it tried to exclude. What followed was not a single invasion, but a long process of entanglement. conflict and cooperation existed side by side. Cities burned, but others adapted. Roman law weakened, but did not vanish. Germanic customs blended with imperial structures. The world was not ending, it was transforming. In hindsight, the term barbarian invasion hides more than it reveals. What unfolded along the Rhine and Danube was not simply the fall of order before chaos. It was the collision of a rigid imperial system with a fluid human reality. An empire built on control encountered a world on the move. And movement once begun cannot be ordered back into stillness. When emperors could no longer pay their troops, they signed treaties with tribal leaders. You guard our borders, and we will grant you land. Thus, the protectors slowly became the masters. The foederati foreign allies of Rome now ruled her provinces. A wolf had been invited into the sheepfold, and it would never leave again. 410 A.D., the fall of Rome, the night of August 24th, 410. Church bells rang faintly through smoke and flame. The Visigoths, led by King Alaric, stormed the Salarian Gate. Rome, the eternal city, was sacked for the first time in nearly 800 years. People fled through broken streets, crying. Torches burned bright within the Colosseum. Statues of gods were toppled, gold and silver plundered. News spread across Europe like thunder. Rome has fallen. Words once unthinkable had become reality. For those who lived it, this was not merely politics, it was the end of the world. For if Rome, the heart of the world, could fall, what could possibly stand? The empire divided. After Emperor Theodosius I died in 395, the Roman Empire split forever. The Eastern Empire and Constantinople, rich and strong. The Western Empire in Rome, weak, bankrupt, and besieged. Western emperors became puppets of Germanic generals. They ruled on parchment, while tribal warlords held the real power. In 476, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the general Odoacer. No great battle, no clash of swords, only a decree of abdication followed by silence. The Roman Senate, once masters of the world, rose to their feet and approved. No one resisted. The Roman Empire ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, from collapse to transformation. Yet the fall of Rome was not a full stop, it was a comma in history. Upon the ruins of amphitheaters and bridges, new kingdoms began to rise: the Franks in Gaul, the seed of France, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths in Italy, and Spain, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Each carried a fragment of Roman memory, its law, its architecture, its tongue. Rome had vanished, but its spirit flowed within the new blood of Europe. As tribal kings fought over land, the Christian Church emerged as the only force capable of uniting the continent. Monks, often nameless in chronicles, copied every text, every scroll, as if desperately trying to preserve the memory of humankind before it turned to dust. Today, historians no longer call 476 the fall, they call it the transformation of the ancient world. Because Rome did not truly die, it merely changed form. Latin evolved into Italian, French, and Spanish. Roman law became the foundation of European justice. Its discipline, architecture, philosophy, and art were reborn within new shapes and languages. Rome may have burned, but its flame kept burning in every monastery, every school, every human hand rebuilding the world. One world had ended, but from its ashes another began to breathe. In the next chapter, we will step into that newborn world where the so-called barbarians built the first kingdoms, where the spirit of chivalry was born, and where Europe raised its spears toward the heavens, searching for a new order. After 476 AD, Europe was no longer an empire, but a shattered map. The stone roads that once led to glory had become the paths of migrants. They came from the northern forests, the central plains, and the faraway steppes. The Goths, Franks, Lombards, and Vandals, once dismissed by Rome as barbari people beyond language and law, were no longer knocking at the gates of the empire. They were inside it. And in many places, they were now its new masters. Not as unified conquerors, not as heirs consciously claiming Rome's legacy, but as peoples who had outlasted a system that could no longer sustain itself. They arrived carrying weapons hardened by migration and war horses bred for long journeys across harsh terrain, and memories shaped by frozen forests, open plains, and lives lived close to uncertainty. But alongside these things, they carried something quieter and more enduring dreams of land that could be cultivated, homes that could be defended, and a peace that did not depend on the favor of distant emperors. Rome had promised order, but rarely belonging. What these people sought was not dominion, but rootedness. Caravans of people moved across the old arteries of empire, the Rhine, the Danube, the Alpine passes that Roman engineers had once carved with pride. These routes, built to project imperial power outward, now guided humanity inward. Families, clans, entire peoples, traveling with what little they could carry. Some crossings were violent, others were negotiated. Many were simply inevitable. There was no longer a clear line between invasion and settlement, between enemy and inhabitant. Abandoned cities were seized, not always destroyed, but repurposed. Roman villas, symbols of elite wealth and centralized authority, were often burned not out of hatred for Rome, but because they no longer made sense in a world without the systems that sustained them. Marble halls gave way to wooden structures. Vast estates fragmented into smaller plots. Grandeur was traded for survivability. And amid the ruins, new villages rose, not planned by imperial decree, but shaped by necessity, near rivers, close to arable land, around churches that had survived when forums had fallen silent. The soundscape of Europe changed. The echo of imperial proclamations faded. In their place came the ringing of church bells, marking time, not by state calendars, but by prayer and seasons, and the steady rhythm of blacksmith hammers forging tools and weapons for daily life rather than conquest. This was not the end of civilization. It was its reconfiguration. Roman law did not vanish overnight. It lingered in contracts, customs, and memory. Latin did not disappear. It softened, fractured, and slowly transformed into new tongues. Christianity spread not as a uniform doctrine imposed from above, but as a shared language of meaning in a fractured world. Germanic kings adopted Roman titles. Roman bishops negotiated with barbarian rulers. The old and the new became inseparable. To those living through it, the age felt like chaos. Authority was local, loyalty was personal, violence was frequent, stability was rare. And yet beneath the disorder, something new was taking shape, slower, rougher, but more human in scale. Power was no longer concentrated in a single distant center. It was dispersed among villages, lords' monasteries, and communities, learning often painfully how to govern themselves. The continent seemed to be reborn in turbulence, but rebirth is never gentle. Out of collapsing empires came new identities. Out of shattered unity came diversity. Out of chaos came the foundations of medieval Europe, a world that would value loyalty over citizenship, faith over law, land over abstract empire. A world that remembered Rome, but no longer depended on it. What followed was not darkness, but transition. And like all transitions, it was loud, uncertain, and irreversible. There were no more emperors, no senate, no unified Rome. The former Roman provinces broke apart into small kingdoms, each ruled by a local chief. Soldiers became lords, and the people long accustomed to obedience became serfs, tied to the soil they worked. There were no national taxes anymore. Wealth was no longer measured in money, but in land, the only thing of value in an unsafe world. Whoever owned land commanded men, and kept soldiers held power. And thus feudalism was born not by decree, but through centuries of fear and survival. A lord pledged loyalty to his superior in exchange for protection. A vassal swore obedience in return for peace to farm his fields. From those oaths emerged an entire social structure where loyalty became the most precious currency of all. While political power crumbled, one force endured: the Christian Church. When tribal kings no longer knew whom to trust, they turned their eyes toward God. Power had become fragile, won by the sword, lost by betrayal, and alliances shifted like sand beneath their feet. A crown no longer guaranteed loyalty. Bloodlines no longer promised continuity. In a world where yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's executioner, divine authority offered something human politics could not permanence. God did not revolt. God did not assassinate. God, at least in belief, stood above the chaos. And when common people no longer knew who truly ruled them, when banners changed laws, dissolved, and new names replaced old ones, they lifted their gaze toward the cross. Not because life had become easier, but because meaning had become scarce. The empire that once defined time order and belonging had vanished. In its place stood uncertainty. Christianity did not arrive as a philosophy to be debated, but as a shelter for the frightened. It offered a story that explained suffering, a hope that extended beyond ruined fields and burned cities, and a promise that justice, even if absent on earth, had not disappeared from the universe. In this fractured world, the monks emerged quietly, almost unnoticed at first. They were not warriors, they were not kings, they commanded no armies, and yet they would become the custodians of something far more enduring than territory memory. Most people could no longer read. Fewer still could write. Literacy, once a tool of administration and commerce, retreated behind monastery walls. There, in stone buildings, often built atop Roman ruins, monks gathered not to preserve power, but to preserve words. They believed that what had been written still mattered, that truth did not expire simply because empires fell. In cold scriptoria, bent over rough wooden desks, they copied texts letter by letter. Roman histories, Greek philosophy, legal codes, medical treatises, and above all, scripture. Each manuscript was an act of resistance against forgetting. Each page copied by hand was a refusal to let the past dissolve entirely into silence. There were no printing presses, no mass distribution. A single book could take months, sometimes years, to complete. Ink froze in winter, fingers cramped, eyes failed in low light. And yet they continued. By candlelight, they traced symbols whose authors had died centuries earlier, believing that knowledge was not theirs to own, but theirs to carry forward. Their candles were small. Their rooms were dim. Outside, the world seemed to be collapsing into violence and fragmentation. But inside those monasteries, something fragile yet powerful endured: continuity. While cities burned and borders shifted, ideas survived quietly, patiently, line by line. The monks did not know they were saving Western civilization. That phrase would have meant nothing to them. They acted out of faith, discipline, and obedience. But history would later recognize what they could not foresee, that without their silence, their repetition, their devotion to preservation over innovation, much of the ancient world would have vanished forever. In an age later mislabeled as dark, these figures carried light, not the blinding light of conquest or empire, but the steady flickering glow of memory. And it was enough. Monasteries rose across Europe, Monte Cassino in Italy, Cluny in France, Iona in Britain. From these silent stone walls, the church came to control not only souls, but also land people and knowledge. And from within that quiet strength, Europe was reshaped by faith. The early Middle Ages was an age of paradox of war and prayer of sword and cross. On the battlefield, the knight, the defining figure of the age, slowly took shape. He did not appear fully formed, nor did he emerge as a romantic hero in shining armor. He arose out of necessity, forged in a world where order had fractured, and protection had become a personal obligation rather than an imperial guarantee. In the absence of Roman legions, survival depended on those who could fight ride and hold ground. But over time, something more than brute force began to gather around this figure. The knight was not merely a warrior. He became a new kind of nobleman, one whose status was earned as much through obligation as through blood. To be a knight was to live under vows to a lord who granted land and protection, and to a god who demanded restraint, justice, and humility. His life was defined by service. He did not fight for himself alone, but as part of a chain of loyalty that bound village to lord to king, and king to the divine order believed to govern all things. The sword he carried was not only an instrument of death, it was a symbol. Its cross-shaped hilt reminded him and everyone who saw it that violence was no longer meant to be arbitrary. Killing without cause was sin. Fighting when justified was duty. In this way, the knight's weapon became a moral object burdened with meaning. To draw it was to accept responsibility before heaven as well as earth. Before battle knights prayed, not always for victory, but for righteousness. They asked to be spared from cowardice, from cruelty, from dishonor. For in a world where chaos was common honor, became a form of inner order. It was something no invader could burn, no rival could steal. Even defeat could be endured if honor remained intact. From this tension emerged the code later called chivalry, not as a written law at first, but as an expectation whispered between generations. Protect the weak. Keep faith with your word. Show mercy when strength allows it. These ideals were often violated, sometimes brutally. Knights were human, shaped by fear, ambition, and rage. But the fact that such ideals existed at all marked a shift. Power was no longer justified by strength alone. It had to answer, at least in principle, to conscience. The knight thus stood between two worlds. He carried the violence of the old age iron blood conquest, but he was asked to temper it with faith and restraint. He was both sword and prayer, both destroyer and guardian. And in that contradiction, medieval society found a fragile balance, not peace, but meaning amid conflict. As centuries passed, the image of the knight would be polished by poetry and legend. But at its core remained something simple and human, a man trying to hold order together with his own body, his own oath, and his own belief that even in war, there must be limits. In the long night after Rome, the knight did not bring light the way monks did through memory and words. He brought a different kind of illumination, the attempt to bind violence to values and strength to responsibility. And for a world learning again how to stand that too was a form of light. Meanwhile, in the monasteries, the saints and scholars fought the same battle in reverse against violence, through knowledge and compassion. One of them was Saint Benedict, who laid the foundation for Western monastic life with the words, Ora et labora pray and work. Two paths battle and prayer together forged the soul of medieval Europe. Among the fractured kingdoms, one people began to rise, the Franks. They settled in Gaul, the former Roman province. Under King Clovis I, the Franks became the first Germanic tribe to convert to Christianity. This was not just a matter of faith, it was politics. When Clovis knelt before the Pope, he was not only baptizing his soul, but cleansing his people's barbarian past. The Franks were now seen as defenders of the faith, and Rome, though no longer an empire, had found a new ally. From that alliance, a kingdom took root, the first seed of what would become France. And in the centuries to come, the Franks would lead the rebirth of Europe itself. While Western Europe drowned in war, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, endured. Its capital, Constantinople, gleamed like a jewel upon the Sea of Marmara. Its walls towering its churches, gilded its scholars, still teaching the philosophy of Greece. Under Justinian I, the empire even reconquered parts of Western Europe and built the magnificent Hagia Sophia, its dome soaring heavenward like a prayer in stone. Byzantium was Rome's living memory. They still spoke Greek, followed Roman law, and saw themselves as the true heirs of Caesar. While the West learned how to live again, the East preserved how to think. By the late 8th century, a new threat rose from the icy north, the Vikings. From Scandinavia, they sailed in long, narrow ships, swift as lightning raiding England, France, and the continental coasts. They burned monasteries, looted villages, and spread terror across Christendom. But they were more than plunderers. The Vikings were also sailors, traders, and settlers. They founded cities like Dublin and York, and opened trade routes reaching as far as the Arab world. One branch, the Varangians, even served in the Byzantine army. Those who came as destroyers inadvertently created a new age of connection, linking Northern Europe to the rest of the known world. By the end of the 10th century, Europe, after nearly 500 years of division, was beginning to reshape itself. From the ruins of Rome, 3 pillars now stood firm: the church, the nobility, and the peasantry. Together, they formed the triangle of power that would sustain Europe for the next 1,000 years. Art, architecture, and writing began to return. Illuminated manuscripts shimmered with gold monasteries, turned into centers of learning, and the first great stone cathedrals reached toward the sky. Darkness, it seemed, had not been the end, but the soil from which light would grow. The early Middle Ages were not an age of darkness, but a slow sunrise of a new world. Upon the ashes of an empire, humanity built a new order, humble, harsh, yet enduring. And from here, Europe would enter its radiant age, the High Middle Ages, the time of crusades of knights and of cathedrals that touched the heavens. While Europe still slumbered in the long night of chaos, another light began to rise from the east, the 7th century. In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, a land of stone wind and unforgiving horizons where survival depended on memory, hospitality, and faith, history shifted direction. This was not a world of marble cities or imperial roads. It was a world of caravans and oases of oral poetry carried across generations of tribal bonds stronger than written law. And it was here, far from the centers of Roman and Persian power, that a quiet rupture began. From the cave of Hira, overlooking Mecca, a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah emerged, carrying no army, no royal lineage, no political mandate. He bore only words spoken, memorized, recited. Words that claimed to come not from human ambition, but from divine command. In a region where gods were many and loyalty was tribal, the message was radical in its simplicity. There is one God, justice matters, the poor are not invisible, and power will answer for itself. At first, the message spread slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was resisted, mocked, feared. Not because it called for violence, but because it threatened the social fabric of Mecca itself. To say that all believers were equal before God was to undermine aristocracy. To condemn exploitation was to question wealth built on imbalance. Revelation in this sense was not abstract theology, it was social critique. When persecution followed, the message did not vanish. It moved. The Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina, marked not only a change of place, but a transformation of faith into community. In Medina, belief became structure, words became law, prayer became rhythm. A scattered following became a society bound not by blood, but by covenant. What followed was not an explosion, but a current. Islam spread not as a single force, but as a convergence of conviction, discipline, and circumstance. The great empires surrounding Arabia, Rome in the west, Persia in the east were exhausted. Decades of war had drained their treasuries, thinned their armies, and fractured their loyalties. Borders existed on maps, but not in spirit. Into this space moved a new worldview, one that fused spiritual devotion with social order. The early Islamic community did not separate faith from governance, prayer from justice, belief from daily life. This integration gave it resilience. Where imperial authority relied on distance and bureaucracy, Islam relied on shared practice and shared meaning. As Muslim armies moved beyond Arabia into Syria, Persia, Egypt, they did not erase the past wholesale. Greek philosophy, Persian administration, Roman infrastructure were not destroyed. They were absorbed, translated, transformed. Mosques rose where temples once stood, but markets continued, irrigation systems were repaired, and knowledge was preserved. Conversion was not always immediate, nor always forced. Often it was gradual, drawn by the promise of order, fairness, and belonging in a collapsing world. Within less than a century, Islam had become the dominant force of the Mediterranean's southern and eastern shores. But its true power did not lie in territory alone. It lay in coherence. In a time when the old world had fractured into feudal loyalties and local powers, Islam offered a universal frame, one God, one community, one moral horizon. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, this expansion appeared sudden, even terrifying. To the peoples of the former Roman and Persian provinces, it often felt like continuity under a new name. Taxes still existed, cities still functioned, but the story people told about the world, about justice, purpose, and accountability, had changed. Islam did not merely conquer space, it reorganized time. Daily prayers structured the day, fasting reoriented the year, pilgrimage reconnected distant regions, memory became sacred, preserved through recitation rather than stone. In a world where libraries burned and roads crumbled, a faith carried in the human voice proved astonishingly durable. The rise of Islam was not the end of the ancient world, nor simply the beginning of a new one. It was a bridge formed not of marble or iron, but of meaning. And as Rome faded into memory and Europe stumbled through fragmentation, a new light burned steadily in the deserts and cities of the Islamic world, a light that would preserve knowledge, cultivate science, and one day return forgotten texts back to the lands that had first written them. History often speaks of swords and battles, but the deeper current of the 7th century was not steel. It was words remembered, repeated, and believed deeply enough to reshape civilizations. After the Prophet Muhammad's death, His successors, the four rightly guided caliphs Rashidun, expanded the realm through campaigns that were both military and spiritual. But under the Umayyad Caliphate in the 8th century, Islam became a true empire stretching from the Indus River in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west, spanning 3 continents. The capital Damascus shone with golden domes, its bazaars thick with the scent of spices, and its astronomers and physicians writing the first pages of what would become Arabic science. A new order was forming, one that Europe would contend with for centuries to come. For nearly 500 years, the Mediterranean had been Rome's inner sea, every ship sailing under the Roman eagle. Now new sails appeared, the white sails of the Arabs, stretching from Alexandria to Cordoba. When Egypt and North Africa fell to Islam, the ancient link between Eastern and Western Europe was severed. The West was isolated, cut off from trade, from knowledge from the East itself. To the Christian world, the sea, once a bridge of civilization, became a barrier of faith. Roman galleys gave way to Muslim warships, carrying merchants, scholars, and missionaries. The Mediterranean, once the center of one empire, had become the meeting and the battleground of 2 civilizations. In the year 711, Muslim forces crossed the narrow waters of the Strait of Gibraltar, stepping onto the Iberian Peninsula at a moment when the old order was already fragile. The Visigothic kingdom that ruled Hispania was internally divided, weakened by succession disputes, regional rivalries, and a brittle political structure that no longer commanded loyalty. What followed was not a long, grinding conquest, but a swift collapse. Within a few years, Visigothic rule crumbled, and from its ruins emerged a civilization unlike anything Western Europe had yet seen. This new world came to be known as Al-Andalus Islamic Spain. It was not merely a change of rulers or religion. It was a transformation of rhythm knowledge and imagination. Where Roman authority had faded and post-imperial Europe struggled to reorganize itself through feudal bonds, Al-Andalus grew as a coherent, confident society rooted in learning, administration, and urban life. At its heart stood Cordoba, the capital and symbol of this new civilization. By the 10th century, Cordoba had become one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth, rivaling Constantinople and Baghdad. While many European towns were still little more than fortified villages, Cordoba shone with paved streets, cleaned regularly streetlights that illuminated the night-flowing water, brought through aqueducts and public baths that preserved the ancient Roman love of hygiene. Hospitals treated the sick not as sinners to be shunned, but as patients to be healed. Surgeons wrote manuals, physicians debated theories, and medicine became a disciplined science rather than a collection of charms. Public baths were not luxuries for elites, but civic spaces woven into daily life. Water, carefully managed, filtered, and distributed, became a symbol of order itself. But it was knowledge that truly defined Al-Andalus. Cordoba's great libraries were legendary. One alone is said to have held over 400,000 volumes, handwritten manuscripts collected from across the Islamic world and beyond. These were not only religious texts, but works of philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, poetry, and law. Aristotle was studied alongside Islamic theologians. Greek science was read through Arabic translation. Roman law conversed with Islamic jurisprudence. At a time when much of Europe still relied on wax tablets and fragile parchment, where literacy was confined largely to monasteries, Cordoba cultivated scholars, translators, poets, and scientists as a class. Knowledge was not hidden behind cloistered walls. It was debated in courts, taught in madrasas, and copied in workshops that hummed with intellectual energy. Al-Andalus was also remarkable for its coexistence. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side in relative tolerance, not equality by modern standards, but a level of pluralism extraordinary for the medieval world. Jewish philosophers wrote in Arabic. Christian scholars translated Islamic texts into Latin. Ideas crossed religious boundaries long before armies ever did. From this soil grew figures who would later reshape Europe itself. Philosophers who reintroduced Aristotle to the West, mathematicians who carried algebra across borders, astronomers who refined calendars, and navigation physicians whose texts would be used in European universities for centuries. Long before the Renaissance bloomed in Florence, its seeds were already flourishing in Córdoba. Al-Andalus was not paradise without conflict. Power shifted. Dynasties rose and fell. Religious tensions hardened over time. But for several centuries, it stood as living proof that the so-called Dark Ages were not dark everywhere. While parts of Europe struggled to remember Rome, Islamic Spain moved forward, preserving the past while building something new. In the long night after Rome's fall, Córdoba burned like a lamp of learning. Its light did not remain confined to Iberia. Slowly through translation, trade, and contact, it crossed the Pyrenees, carrying with it forgotten knowledge, new methods of thought, and a quiet reminder that civilization does not vanish when empires fall. It migrates. And when Europe was ready to awaken again, it would do so in part by the light first kept alive in Al-Andalus. Muslim scholars translated and preserved the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy. They developed Arabic numerals, al-Jabr, algebra, astronomy, and medicine. Here, ancient knowledge was rescued from oblivion to later return to Europe and ignite the Renaissance. While monks in Europe lit candles to pray, Arab scholars lit lamps to read. For Christendom, the rise of Islam was not merely the loss of land. It was a trial of faith. The holy cities, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, fell into the hands of the infidels. The Mediterranean, once uniting the churches, now divided the faithful. Yet in isolation, Europe began to renew itself. Monasteries became centers of production, trade, and education. Agriculture revived, populations grew, and new towns appeared along the Rhine, Seine, and Po rivers. The body of Europe, once paralyzed, began to move again. In the early 8th century, the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyads and moved the capital to Baghdad, a city on the Tigris that became the heart of the Islamic world. Baghdad was not only a capital, it was the center of human knowledge. Here, Caliph al-Ma'mun founded the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a vast academy of translation, research, and discovery. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic, then traveled onward to Byzantium, Venice, and Paris. Scholars like al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the great physician, and Alhazen, the father of optics, laid the groundwork for modern science. Muslims had learned from the Greeks how to think, and then taught Europe how to reason. Rome fell by the sword, but was saved by knowledge, and that knowledge came from Baghdad. 5. Between admiration and fear. While Islam expanded south and east, the Christian kingdoms of the North France, England, Germany consolidated power. Limited trade across the Mediterranean resumed, bringing spices and goods, but also curiosity and unease. Europe looked upon Islam with mixed eyes, admiration for its learning and refinement, suspicion for its foreign faith and distant city of prayer, Mecca. Over the 11th century, tension grew where these borders of belief met. And in 1095, Pope Urban II would ignite the first holy flame, the Crusades. By the end of the 9th century, the Mediterranean was no longer Rome's lake. It had become the axis of two of the world's greatest civilizations, To the north, Christian Europe was maturing, rebuilding law, feudal order, and art. To the south, the Islamic world flourished, rich in science, commerce, and culture. Between them, Byzantium stood as a fragile bridge, trading with one hand, guarding with the other. Once again, the sea became the stage of humanity, where merchant ships crossed paths, where war galleys clashed, where ideas met and collided. And from that collision, history moved forward. The Roman Empire once united the world through power. Islam reconnected it through faith. And from opposite shores of the Mediterranean, humankind learned the first great lesson of the Middle Ages, that true power flows not only from the sword, but from the mind. From the ruins of Rome, the church became the spiritual bridge of Europe. But at the same time, that very faith also split the world in two. From the 6th to the 10th century, while Europe's kingdoms were still taking shape, the Christian church stood as the only pillar left standing. Monasteries rose everywhere, not only for prayer, but as centers of learning, agriculture, and charity. In Britain, in 596, Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission to Kent, beginning the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. Monks like Augustine of Canterbury turned religion into a tool of social cohesion, bringing writing language and even the Roman concept of law to the wild northern lands. In a Europe without nation-states, the church was the state of the soul, two centers of one faith. When the Roman Empire split east and west, 395 faith itself was stretched between two capitals, Rome, where the Pope led the Western Church in Latin, Constantinople, where the Patriarch led the Eastern Church in Greek. When the empire divided, not only the map changed, the soul of Christianity was cleaved in two. In the West, centered on Rome, Latin became the breath of church law and learning. Here, the Pope was not only spiritual leader, but the successor of St. Peter, of whom Scripture says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." From this Rome held that the Pope bore supreme authority, the rock on which Christ founded the universal church. For them, faith could not endure without a single guiding center. By contrast, in the East, where Constantinople shone above the Sea of Marmara, faith took on another character. The Byzantines spoke Greek, read Scripture in its original tongue, and remained wedded to the spirit of Greek philosophy, seeking God through contemplation symbol and inner light. For them, the church did not belong to one man, but to a communion of souls equal before God. Christ is the head of the church, and we are his body. St. Paul's words were taken as the core of Eastern Orthodoxy. While Rome built a centralized system of authority, Constantinople cultivated a mystical conciliar and communal faith. One was the see of law and order, the other the capital of symbol and theology. To Latin eyes, Constantinople was too soft, ambiguous in doctrine. To Greek eyes, Rome was coarse, overly rational, and hungry for power. They still prayed the same prayers, but they no longer heard one another's echo. The differences were not only doctrinal, but cultural and political. The East Byzantium kept Greek philosophy, ancient rites, and theological subtlety. The Latin West pursued organization, discipline, and centralized authority. In the East, the Eucharist used leavened bread. In the West, unleavened. Eastern clergy could marry. Western clergy vowed lifelong celibacy. These differences were hairline cracks beneath the marble floor of a great cathedral, and one day they would split the whole edifice, the politics of faith. By the early 11th century, there was no Roman Empire left to unify Europe. The Church became the only force strong enough to fill the void. Between the two poles of faith, Rome and Constantinople, an unavoidable contest began. In the West, Pope Leo IX was a reformer of grand vision. He believed that God's authority had been entrusted fully to the papacy, that every bishop and every church, no matter how far, must submit to Rome. Under him, the Holy See began to look like a sacred court with laws legates and an ambition to restore a Roman order by faith. In the East, Patriarch Michael Cerularius, born amid the splendor of Byzantium, an empire still alive with emperors' armies, and learning saw no reason to bow to Rome. To Byzantine eyes, old Rome had fallen. The true Rome still lived themselves. We are the heirs of Constantine the Great. No one has the right to teach us our faith. Words recorded in a letter sent westward. Between these worlds, the boundary was no longer theology, but power, who truly represented God on earth. Thus, when Pope Leo IX sent a delegation led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida to Constantinople in 1053, the declared aim was reconciliation, but the deeper purpose was to assert Rome's supremacy. Humbert, a severe, confident, and frigid scholar, carried a papal letter proclaiming that all sacred authority proceeds from the Roman See. To him, Constantinople was not a partner in dialogue, but a defendant that must submit. When he entered the gilded city, he saw blazing mosaics and long Greek liturgies, a religious world utterly unlike Rome. Instead of wonder, he felt challenged. Cerularius, proud and unbending, refused to receive the legates with full honors. He kept them waiting for days, no banquets, no welcome. What had been billed as a conversation between the faithful turned into a trial between two judges. Every word carried the scent of politics. Every rite became a proclamation. And within the East's most splendid cathedral, each side believed it was defending the faith, but in truth, they were defending God's throne. July 16th, 1054. Inside Hagia Sophia, the great church that had once embodied the unity of Christian faith and Roman legacy, the air was thick with incense and chant. The divine liturgy was underway, a ritual meant to dissolve earthly divisions into heavenly harmony. And yet, at that precise moment, division walked in with deliberate steps. Cardinal Humbert, legate of the Pope, strode toward the altar. Without waiting for permission, without pausing for reverence, he placed upon it a parchment sealed with wax, a bull of excommunication. In that single act, performed in the holiest space of Eastern Christianity, he publicly declared Michael Cerularius and the Eastern Church to be heretical. The shock was immediate, but the rupture was not yet complete. 3 days later, Cerularius answered, not with negotiation, not with silence, but with a mirror act of defiance. He excommunicated the Roman delegation itself, 2 documents, 2 seals, 2 absolute judgments, and with them, a 1,000-year-old house of faith cracked down its center. This was not merely a theological disagreement finally spoken aloud. It was the collapse of a shared imagination. For centuries, Christians in East and West had prayed to the same God, revered the same councils, and called themselves one body, even as their languages, customs, and politics drifted apart. The events of 1054 did not create division from nothing. They made irreversible what had been growing silently for generations. The Great Schism formalized the split of Christianity into 2 enduring worlds, Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. From that moment on, the wound would never truly heal. In the West, Rome slowly reshaped itself. The Pope, once a spiritual leader among others, began to rise above kings and emperors, claiming authority not only over souls, but over crowns. This ascent laid the groundwork for crusading ideology, for papal supremacy, and for a new religious architecture. Gothic cathedrals soared upward, stone prayers reaching toward heaven, proclaiming a faith that sought transcendence through height and grandeur. God was above, and humanity strained upward to meet him. In the East, the Byzantine world turned inward and deeper. Eastern Orthodoxy did not pursue domination over rulers in the same way. Instead, it cultivated continuity ritual and sacred presence. The soul of Greece, philosophical, contemplative, liturgical, found refuge in orthodoxy. Icons were not treated as decoration or illustration. They were theology made visible. Every icon was believed to be a window, not a picture, a threshold through which the divine could be encountered rather than imagined. Thus, after 1054, Christianity did not simply divide administratively. It diverged in temperament. The West emphasized law hierarchy and mission. The East emphasized mystery continuity and participation in the sacred. One leaned toward structure and expansion, the other toward preservation and depth. The tragedy of the Great Schism lies not only in separation, but in lost complementarity. Two ways of approaching the same divine reality turned away from one another, each convinced the other had erred. And as centuries passed, the distance hardened, reinforced by language barriers, political conflicts, and eventually bloodshed during the Crusades. Inside Hagia Sophia, on that summer day in 1054, no walls collapsed, no armies clashed. The liturgy continued. Yet something invisible and immense gave way. The unity of Christendom, already strained, finally fractured. And from that fracture emerged two civilizations, each carrying the same faith, but walking different paths through history. The common house did not fall in ruins. It split into two homes facing away from one another, each preserving a fire, each convinced the other had let something essential go out. Both held fast to faith. But now they looked up to the same heaven by two different roads. The schism of 1054 was not merely a disagreement between bishops, nor simply a clash of doctrines written in theological language. It became a turning point that quietly redrew the inner map of Europe, a fault line not carved by rivers or mountains, but by differing visions of how the sacred should inhabit the world. From that moment onward, West and East did not simply worship differently. They learned to imagine reality differently. In the West, faith gradually aligned itself with structure, law, and outward action. The Roman Church developed a legal mind canon law hierarchy codification definition. Truth was something to be clarified, articulated, defended. God was approached through reason as much as through mystery. Cities grew, universities emerged, and theology entered dialogue with philosophy and later with science. Cathedrals rose not only as places of worship, but as civic monuments, declarations that faith could organize space society and time itself. Power followed this logic. The Pope stood above kings. Authority became centralized. The Church learned to act in history, to send armies to bless crowns, to discipline nations. From this trajectory would come the Crusades, scholasticism, the Renaissance, and eventually the modern secular state. Even when Europe later rebelled against the Church, it did so using tools the Church itself had refined: law, argument institutions, cities. In the East, the path bent in another direction. Eastern Christianity did not seek to dominate history so much as to endure within it. Rather than codifying belief endlessly, it protected ritual. Rather than systematizing doctrine, it deepened liturgy. Theology was sung more often than debated. The goal was not to master the world, but to sanctify the heart. Icons replaced statues. Chant replaced proclamation. Silence replaced definition. In the Orthodox world, truth was not something to conquer intellectually, but something to enter slowly through prayer, fasting, and continuity. The Church became a guardian of memory, preserving ancient forms, ancient language, ancient rhythms, even as empires rose and fell around it. These were not merely religious preferences, they shaped entire civilizations. In the West, time became linear and progressive, always moving forward, improving, conquering. In the East, time remained cyclical and liturgical, returning again and again to the same feasts, the same prayers, the same sacred moments. One world asked, "What can we build next?" The other asked, "What must we not forget?" And so a line formed, not always visible, but always felt. From the Balkans, where Catholic and Orthodox villages still face one another, across invisible borders. Along the Dnieper, where baptism once tied Russes to Byzantium rather than Rome. From Rome, city of law and papal authority, to Moscow, city of the Third Rome, heir to Byzantine spirituality after Constantinople fell. That line survived empires, wars, revolutions, and ideologies. It survived even atheism, for even when belief weakened, the underlying habits of thought remained. Western societies continued to trust systems, institutions' progress. Eastern societies continued to value endurance, identity, and spiritual depth. The Great Schism did not declare one side right and the other wrong. History itself refuses such simplicity. Instead, it divided a once unified faith into two complementary responses to the same human question: how to live with the sacred in an unstable world. One chose expansion, the other chose preservation. And to this day, Europe still breathes with those two lungs, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, shaped by a rupture that occurred not with swords or fire, but with parchment seals and words spoken in a sacred space, a split quiet enough to seem small at the time, and deep enough to still shape the world we inhabit today. Faith once bound the world together, but it was also what split the world in two. A new dynasty was rising in the West, seeking to recrystallize the Roman spirit in a new form. This is the story of the Carolingians and the seed of the Holy Roman Empire. The 8th century. Across the plains between the Rhine and the Seine, the Frankish kingdom rose a Germanic people already woven into Roman culture. Over generations, they became the bridge between Europe's past and its future. Their first dynasty, the Merovingians, had been founded by Clovis I, who received baptism into Christianity. But by the 8th century, the Merovingians had grown weak kings in name only, while real power lay with officials called the mayors of the palace. Among them was a man named Charles Martel, the Hammer. In 732, he defeated Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours, halting Islam's advance into Western Europe. It was not only a military victory, it was a moment when Christianity was pulled back from the brink. From then on, the House of Martel became the emblem of strength and loyalty to the Church. And one generation later, his son Pippin the Short would change history. Pippin, small in stature, great in ambition, understood that Europe needed a real king, not a relic of the past. He asked Pope Zachary I a question that would redirect history: who is more worthy to be king, the one with the title, or the one who truly holds power? The Pope replied, the one who holds power is the one chosen by God. And so, in 751, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian and proclaimed himself king of the Franks, laying the foundation for the Carolingian dynasty. In return, he granted the Pope territories in Italy, the donation of Pippin, beginning the Papal States. For the first time in centuries, royal power and sacred power clasped hands, and from that alliance, a new empire would be born. When Pippin died, the throne passed to his son Charles, whom posterity calls Charlemagne Charles the Great. He was born into a world half wild, half-hallowed dense Saxon forests filled with warriors, broad plains where papal envoys rode by candlelight. Charlemagne was not only a warrior, he was an architect of Europe. Over 46 years of rule, he expanded the Frankish realm into the largest empire in Western Europe, since Caesar from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Ebro to the Elbe. But what made him unforgettable was not only his victories, it was his vision. He believed the sword could not build faith alone. It required letters law and learning. Christmas night, 800 in St. Peter's in Rome. Charlemagne knelt amid the solemn rite. As the sacred chants rose, Pope Leo III approached, placed a golden crown upon his head, and proclaimed Charles Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. The basilica erupted, "Long live the Emperor." In that instant, Rome was reborn, not by arms, but by faith. From the ashes of the past, the Holy Roman Empire began to germinate. Yet Charlemagne did not see himself as a ruler who dominates, but as a man entrusted by God to guard civilization. He called himself Rex et Sacerdos King, and servant of God. When Charlemagne took the crown, late 8th to early 9th century Europe had endured nearly 3 centuries of deurbanization. Libraries ruined, schools closed, literacy reduced to a privilege of the clergy. The Frankish nobility, many bishops included, could not read Latin. Even the scriptures suffered from copyist errors after generations of manual transmission. Charlemagne realized, if faith is to be renewed, learning must be renewed. He believed that knowledge is the highest service to God, and ignorance the enemy of belief, hence the emblematic maxim, ignorance is the enemy of faith. Reform schools, script, and law. Aachen, the center of learning. Charlemagne turned his capital, Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, into a new Rome of the north. He invited Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon scholar, along with intellectuals from Italy, Spain, and Ireland, to gather in the royal palace, often likened to Europe's first university. There they set the foundations of what we call the Carolingian Renaissance, founding schools at every major monastery and parish to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and chant, standardizing the copying of sacred texts, ensuring every Bible was accurate and uniformly presented, reforming script by creating Carolingian minuscule, with clear capitals and lowercase punctuation, and spaces between words far more legible than classical scriptio continua. That script across centuries became the basis of modern Latin lettering and today's Roman type. Through it, Roman knowledge did not vanish. It was reborn in a more accessible form. Capitularies, the dawn of European rule of law. Charlemagne did not only build schools, he built law. He issued capitularies collections of decrees arranged by chapters, capitula setting norms for education administration morals and military obligations. What may appear at first as a list of administrative orders was in fact something far more radical. When Charlemagne ruled, Europe was still emerging from centuries of fragmentation. Power was local, memory was fragile, and authority depended largely on personal loyalty rather than shared rules. To govern such a world, Charlemagne understood that swords were not enough. Order had to be taught, remembered, and written. That is why his reforms began not with armies, but with schools. Each diocese was ordered to open a school not only to train clergy, but to ensure that basic literacy did not disappear from society altogether. Every monastery was instructed to teach children reading and writing, regardless of whether they would one day take religious vows. Knowledge was no longer treated as a private inheritance of elites, but as a responsibility tied to governance itself. To rule, one had to read. To obey, one had to understand. Even local officials were drawn into this new moral framework. They were commanded to keep honest records of taxes, of court cases, of land and obligation. Accuracy became a virtue. Writing became a tool of justice. For the first time since the fall of Rome, law was being reimagined not as the whim of a powerful man, but as something written down, preserved, and applied according to a shared standard. These measures did not create modern democracy, but they laid something just as essential, the foundation of Europe's rule of law. Law was no longer only spoken or remembered. It was documented. Not perfect, not equal, but repeatable. And repeatability is the seed of justice. This movement, later called the Carolingian Renaissance, did not seek innovation for its own sake. It sought recovery. Charlemagne believed that the wisdom of ancient Rome could be restored purified and given new life through Christianity. Roman order would provide structure. Christian faith would provide meaning. That vision expressed itself not only in governance, but in art, music, and architecture. Charlemagne revived Roman artistic forms, symmetry, proportion, geometry, but infused them with Christian symbolism. Manuscripts became clearer, more legible. A new script, Carolingian minuscule, was developed, so texts could be read consistently across the empire. This was not decoration, it was infrastructure for thought. Music, too, was unified. Chant was standardized so that prayer would sound the same from one end of the empire to the other. Faith was no longer only local, it became communal across distance. Voices separated by hundreds of miles sang the same melodies, reinforcing the idea that they belonged to one moral world. Architecture, however, was where the vision crystallized most clearly. At the heart of Charlemagne's capital rose the Palatine Chapel, an octagonal structure crowned by a commanding dome. Its form deliberately echoed Hagia Sophia, the great church of Byzantium's symbol of imperial Christianity. But this was no imitation. Where Hagia Sophia overwhelmed with vastness and light, the Palatine Chapel emphasized clarity, proportion, and solidity. Stone replaced marble excess. Geometry replaced ornament. It was Rome remembered through a Western lens. The chapel became a statement carved in stone, the union of Roman reason and Christian soul. Not an empire of spectacle, but an empire of order. Not a world ruled by chaos or charisma alone, but by disciplined learning and faith aligned. In that building, one could feel the ambition of a civilization trying to rebuild itself, not by conquering the past, but by understanding it. Charlemagne's reforms did not survive intact. His empire fractured soon after his death, but the idea endured that civilization rests not only on power, but on education, not only on belief, but on structure, not only on inspiration, but on memory carefully preserved. And in that sense, these schools, laws, and buildings were not merely policies or monuments. They were Europe teaching itself how to think again, slowly, imperfectly, but deliberately after centuries of forgetting. Music, too, was standardized. Charlemagne promoted Gregorian chant, laying foundations for Europe's choral tradition. The era's art did not flaunt gold. It emphasized light-order reverence. This was the early Romanesque sensibility, the seed from which Gothic would later rise. From the 9th century onward, the fruits of the Carolingian Renaissance became the bedrock of Western education. Every major monastery kept a scriptorium. Copies of the Bible and ancient Greek-Latin texts in philosophy and mathematics were preserved. Charlemagne's school network prefigured the medieval universities to come Paris, Bologna, Oxford. Over 90% of the Latin literature we possess today survives because it was copied in the Carolingian age. Without those reforms, Roman learning would have turned to dust. Thus, Charlemagne was not only an emperor, he was the first great architect of Europe's collective intellect. The sword may found an empire, but only knowledge can sustain it. When Charlemagne died, 814, the empire passed to Louis the Pious, then to his grandsons. But as with Rome before, its unity did not last. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire into three parts: West Francia, the seat of France; East Francia, the core of Germany; and Middle Francia, the in-between realm that soon unraveled. These three fragments became the three political pillars of medieval Europe. Though the Carolingian Empire fell, the seed of a Europe united under faith remained to be reborn centuries later as the Holy Roman Empire under German rulers. Charlemagne is remembered as Pater Europae, the father of Europe, not because he ruled the largest territory, but because he reshaped what Europe believed itself to be. Others before him had conquered lands. Charlemagne did something quieter and more enduring. He widened a continent's mind. Before him, Europe was a patchwork of fear and memory tribes clinging to survival kingdoms, bound by blood faith, scattered and uneven. Under Charlemagne, these fragments were drawn into a shared horizon. Faith was no longer merely inherited custom. It became an ideal that could educate discipline and unify. Law was no longer just the command of the strong. It became a foundation written down, taught, and expected to endure beyond any single ruler. Learning, fragile after centuries of collapse, was lifted again as a guiding light rather than an elite luxury. Charlemagne did not imagine Europe as a nation. That idea would come much later. He imagined it as a moral and intellectual space, a civilization bound together by shared texts, shared prayers, shared standards of rule, and a shared inheritance of Rome filtered through Christianity. To govern was not only to command, but to cultivate. That is why his legacy did not end with his death in 814. Empires fell apart quickly in the medieval world, but ideas did not. Charlemagne's vision seeped into monasteries where monks continued to teach children to read. It lived in churches where liturgy followed a common rhythm. It endured in books copied in scripts designed for clarity, not ornament. It echoed in chants sung the same way across distant regions, making Europe feel, for the first time since Rome, like a connected world. In later centuries, when German emperors crossed the Alps to be crowned in Rome, they did so under Charlemagne's shadow. They called themselves successors of Charlemagne, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. To rule legitimately, they needed more than armies, they needed continuity. And Charlemagne had become the bridge between ancient Rome and medieval Christendom, the proof that a Western empire could exist without Caesar, without pagan gods, and without forgetting law and learning. Even the title Holy Roman Emperor carried his imprint. It was an echo of his coronation in the year 800, when Rome crowned not a Roman, but a Frank, signaling that the center of gravity in Europe had shifted northward, yet remained tethered to Roman memory. Europe was no longer the Mediterranean world alone. It was becoming something broader, colder, more varied, but still united by an inherited idea of order. Charlemagne's greatness lies not in perfection. His reign knew violence, coercion, and contradiction. Conversion was not always gentle. Power was not always just. But history does not remember him for purity. It remembers him for direction. He pointed Europe toward a future in which faith could coexist with reason, authority with law, and power with responsibility. In the long Middle Ages that followed centuries, often mislabeled as stagnant or dark, Charlemagne's imprint remained like a watermark beneath the page. Whenever Europe tried to rebuild order after chaos, it returned to the same pillars he had raised: schools, texts, law, ritual, and the belief that civilization must be taught, not assumed. To call him Father of Europe is not to claim that Europe was born fully formed under his rule. It is to say that he gave it something every civilization needs to grow: a memory of what it could be, and a structure strong enough to carry that memory forward. And in that sense, Charlemagne did not merely rule Europe for a lifetime. He helped Europe remember itself for a millennium. Charlemagne did not recreate Rome. He made Rome the living memory of Europe. But while emperors and churchmen were raising an empire from stone, and faith from the north, unfamiliar sails were drawing near, bringing fear, and with it a new chapter for the world. While the Holy Roman Empire was raising churches of stone from the cold north, a storm was forming, bringing song on the wind, the sting of salt, and an unquenchable hunger for freedom. The 8th century. In Scandinavia, now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, summers were brief, the land harsh, and the sea the only lifeline. Men there were born amid iron and storms. When agriculture could no longer feed the people, they turned their eyes to the sea, and the sea became their destiny. In their culture, to die in bed was shameful. Only death upon a warship opened the gates of Valhalla, the warrior's heaven. They called themselves Vikings, not the name of a single people, but a title for those who put out to sea. They were farmers, smiths, shipmasters, but when the waves rose, they all became warriors. On June 8th, 793, an event that shocked Europe, the Lindisfarne Monastery off the English coast was attacked. Monks were slain, the church plundered, relics carried off. Nothing more terrible has ever been seen in Britain, so records the Anglo-Saxon chronicle serpents in the sky lightning and the wrath of God. To Christians, it was a crime. To the Norse, it was the dawn of an age. They did not know they were opening a new medieval chapter. They only knew that out there were gold, wheat, and untilled lands. From Scandinavia, hundreds of longships slid to sea like a brood of iron serpents. Blood-red sails billowed in the wind, and every stroke of the oar beat to the rhythm of survival. The Vikings' true power lay not in the sword, but in seamanship. They built long, narrow, shallow draft vessels, swift on open water, yet able to slip far up rivers. That let them appear everywhere from the shores of England and the Loire in France to the Mediterranean itself. The Vikings were also merchants. They traded furs, amber, and iron for silver and wine. They opened a network binding northern Europe, the Arab world, Byzantium, what later historians would call the Baltic route. 3 paths of expansion, westward, the road of conquest. From Denmark and Norway, they pushed into England, Scotland, Ireland. They raided, but they also settled, founding Dublin, 841. They blended with locals to form the Norse Gaels. By the 10th century, Canute the Great ruled England, Denmark, and Norway, making himself the second most powerful monarch in Western Europe after the German emperor. Under him, Vikings were not only warriors, but rulers, eastward, the road of gold and silk. From Sweden, they rode along the Volga and Dnieper, trading with Slavic tribes and Arab merchants. Eastern peoples called them the Rus, and they were the seed of Kievan Rus's precursor to today's Russia and Ukraine. Viking fighters served as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire, known as the Varangian Guard, fair-haired men with round shields and heavy axes, who became the emperor's elite bodyguards in Constantinople. Northwestward, the road to the Atlantic. From Norway, they reached Iceland, 874, then farther Greenland, 982, and even Vinland, now thought to be Newfoundland, Canada. The expedition was led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland. Leif made landfall in Vinland around the year 1000 when Europe knew nothing of the Americas, meaning the Vikings set foot in the New World nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The Viking world was not only blood and iron, but poetry and myth. They told of Odin, the one-eyed seeker of wisdom, of Thor, the warrior with the hammer Mjolnir battling giants, and of Ragnarok, the day the world burns in its own fire. These tales lived by word of mouth for centuries and later became the Eddas, the treasury of Norse literature. Yet by the 10th century, as trade and contact with Europe grew, many Vikings converted to Christianity. A symbolic moment in 995, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway ordered Odin's temples torn down and raised the first church at Trondheim. Mythic fire slowly yielded to candlelight. The last Viking warriors no longer fought for Valhalla, but for a new faith, and thus the Viking Age ended not in blood, but in baptism. Autumn 1066. Harold Hardrada of Norway invaded England. At Stamford Bridge, he faced Harold Godwinson. The battle was fierce. Steel fell like rain. An arrow struck Harold in the throat. The Viking army broke. It was the Vikings' final battle and the close of an age nearly 3 centuries long. Weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself fell at Hastings, defeated by William of Normandy, a descendant of Vikings who had settled in France. When Vikings died on the battlefield, they did not vanish. They dissolved into Europe's blood. Though branded barbarians, the Vikings left deep marks on history. They rekindled Europe's trade networks after the darkest centuries. They carried shipbuilding arts, metallurgy, and an adventuring will down to the Mediterranean. They sowed in Europe's cultural DNA a spirit of exploration and conquest, the same that would later send Columbus Magellan and Leif Erikson across the seas. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were bridge builders between antiquity and modernity. They restored the flow of commerce, revived the maritime spirit, and proved that freedom can take root even in ice. From shores where the wind howls like the voice of the gods, they set out carrying the world's fears and their own dreams. And in every ship there was a seed, the seed of a will, to discover the force that would keep Europe from ever standing still. As the northern sails fell silent, another empire in the East, Byzantium, still shone in the dark. While Western Europe was still torn apart by sword and faith in the East, another Rome endured, not through the power of emperors, but through the persistence of intellect. After 476, when Rome in the West fell, the East stood firm. This was Byzantium, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire. Its capital, Constantinople, was built by Emperor Constantine the Great in the 4th century, straddling Europe and Asia, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean, a position that made it the very heart of the ancient world. For more than a millennium, Byzantium served both as the shield of Christianity and the treasury of Greco-Roman civilization. Justinian the Great, the dream of a restored Rome. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I ascended the throne. He was not merely a ruler, but the last great dreamer of Rome. His vision was to restore the unity of the Roman Empire. One God, one faith, one law, one empire. Under his reign, Byzantium reached the height of its power. He sent his brilliant general Belisarius to reconquer North Africa, Italy, and much of the western Mediterranean. He commissioned the construction of Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent architectural wonder of the Middle Ages, its dome seeming to float in mid-air, where light poured down as if from heaven itself. And most importantly, he issued the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Roman civil code, which systematized the entire body of ancient law and became the foundation of European legal systems for more than 1,000 years. Yet every glory has its price. The long wars, the plague of Justinian in 541, that claimed over a third of the empire's population, and the crushing weight of taxes drove the people to revolt. No one can hold light without being burned by it. By the end of the 6th century, Byzantium was exhausted. The lands Justinian had reclaimed fell again, Italy to the Lombards, while Slavs and Bulgars swept down into the Balkans. And from the southern deserts, a new faith was rising, Islam, the empire under siege. In the 7th century, Byzantium was pushed onto the defensive. Under Emperor Heraclius, they defeated the Persian Sassanids, only to face the lightning advance of Arab armies. Egypt, Syria, and much of the Near East were lost. Still, Constantinople stood firm. The city was girded by the mighty triple Theodosian walls and armed with its secret weapon, Greek fire, a flammable liquid hurled from ships that burned even on water, saving the empire during 2 great sieges, 674 and 717. Byzantium drew inward, shrinking from a global empire to a fortress realm still alive, but scarred by 1,000 battles, the iconoclast crisis. In the 8th century, a new war erupted, not on the battlefield, but within the soul of faith itself. It was the iconoclasm, the crisis over holy images. Some emperors declared the veneration of icons heretical, a corruption of pure faith. Statues were smashed. Paintings burned. Monasteries defied imperial orders. Blood was shed inside the very churches meant for prayer. Those years split Byzantium in two between those who defended the icons and those who destroyed them. Yet within that turmoil, something else was reborn, an independent spirit of inquiry, where people began to question faith power and truth itself. Those who shattered the holy images unwittingly carved the face of humanity anew, the Macedonian Renaissance. After the stormlight returned, in the late 9th century, under Emperor Basil the empire entered what became known as the Byzantine Renaissance. Basil, born a peasant in Armenia, rose through talent and vision, bringing rare stability to the empire. He reformed administration, strengthened the army, and patronized literature, art, and philosophy. Constantinople flourished once more, libraries reopened, schools revived, and the golden mosaics once shattered, glimmered again across the city's domes. Under Basil and his successor, Leo VI, the empire not only regained lands in the Balkans and Anatolia, but reasserted itself as a cultural and intellectual center of Europe. The 9th century also witnessed the missionary journeys of Saints Cyril and Methodius, 2 Byzantine monks who brought Christianity and writing to the Slavic peoples. They created the Glagolitic script, which later evolved into Cyrillic, laying the foundation of Slavic literature in Russia, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Through their work, Byzantine culture spread across Eastern Europe, forming the roots of Eastern Orthodoxy. While Western Europe descended into feudalism, Byzantium preserved the rhythm of Greek scholarship, the philosophy of Aristotle, the medicine of Hippocrates, the geometry of Euclid, copied, taught, and passed on. Centuries later, these very manuscripts would rekindle Europe's Renaissance. Byzantium was not merely the continuation of Rome, it was the bridge between the ancient and the medieval, the East and the West. While Western kingdoms were torn by feudal wars, Byzantium maintained its bureaucracy, taxation law, and education, a beacon that illuminated humanity's long night. They did not merely guard knowledge, they kept it alive, breathing, and evolving. When the Macedonian dynasty finally closed, Constantinople remained the richest city in the world, a crossroads where gold, silk, and ideas converged. Byzantium lived not only within its walls, but in the way Europe learned to think, to write, and to pray. They were the keepers of Rome's memory and the seed of light that would one day return. After centuries of war, Europe could once again hear its own heartbeat, no longer the clash of swords, but the rhythm of hammers, the tolling of bells, and the sound of voices singing in the open squares. From the 11th to the 13th centuries, Europe entered the High Middle Ages, an age of cities, commerce, and soaring stone vaults. The population grew at an unprecedented rate, from about 35 million to nearly 80 million in just 4 centuries. Land was reclaimed, forests, cleared, villages expanded. Fields once barren under the shadow of war now rippled green with wheat. And as agriculture produced surplus, people turned to crafts, trade, and construction. It was the Great Awakening of Europe. Society still followed the feudal order, but it had become more refined. Nobles now lived in stone castles instead of wooden forts. Peasants rented land, paid dues and taxes in return for protection against raids and bandits. At the center of every region stood the monastery, a place of prayer, but also of production and learning. Monks grew grapes, brewed ale, taught students, copied manuscripts, acting as the custodians of Europe's knowledge. Though peasants remained poor, life was more stable than ever before. They worked by the seasons, joined village festivals, and celebrated holy days. Faith seeped into every aspect of life. The church bell had become the clock of society itself. Around the 11th century, from the small markets around castles or monasteries' towns, began to rise burghs, bourgs, boroughs. Merchants gathered to trade wool, salt, wine metals, then built brick houses and paved streets. Venice, Genoa, and Florence in Italy, Bruges, Ghent, and Cologne in the north became the busiest trading centers of the world. There, money ledgers, guilds, and commercial law were born, marking a new world, one that belonged not only to nobles and clergy, but to workers, merchants, and craftsmen. The Romanesque world. Before Gothic Europe lived under the Romanesque style, in the manner of Rome, yet infused with Christian devotion. From the 10th to the 12th centuries, thousands of churches rose across the continent. Thick walls, rounded arches, small windows, each stone a prayer carved by hand. Romanesque art embodied steadfast faith and humility. Painters decorated the walls with mineral pigments, depicting biblical scenes, not in realism, but in symbolic imagery. Sculptors carved directly onto the portals of churches, the Last Judgment angels, demons, and saints. Everything felt heavy and eternal, as if humankind was still holding back the darkness and the weight of time. The birth of light Gothic. By the mid-12th century, in the region of Île-de-France, near Paris, an abbot named Suger conceived a daring vision. A church must not only be a place of prayer, it must be a place where the light of God can pierce through stone. He rebuilt the Basilica of Saint-Denis, using the pointed arch flying buttress and stained glass to capture light from every direction. Thus began the era of Gothic architecture, one of humanity's greatest artistic triumphs. Gothic was unlike Romanesque in every way. It was taller, lighter, and radiant with color. Instead of fearing Judgment Day, people now lifted their eyes heavenward, believing they were already walking in a paradise of light. From Saint-Denis, the Gothic wave spread across Europe: Chartres-Reims, Amiens, Notre-Dame de Paris, Cologne, Westminster. Each cathedral became a declaration of both faith and science. Architects were no longer mere builders. They were engineers, mathematicians, and poets of form. They calculated proportions, pressure, and luminosity, yet built with hearts that soared alongside their spires. Villagers from miles away donated peasants, brought stones, artisans crafted glass priests offered prayers. A cathedral could take a century to complete. Its first builders often died long before sunlight touched the final stained window. But no one doubted they were building not for themselves, but for God. The 13th century, the summit of the Middle Ages. After centuries of sowing faith, Europe was now harvesting knowledge and creativity. The stone towers stood firm, the fertile fields sustained the people, and now humankind began to ask, after God, who creates next? The answer was themselves. From the monastic schools founded under Charlemagne grew the first universities of Europe: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca. Their narrow wooden halls filled with candle smoke and the scratching of quills on parchment became the birthplaces of intellectual revolution. Students, monks, and scholars from every land spoke a single language, Latin, the shared tongue of knowledge and prayer. Amid the wooden benches, they debated the nature of the soul, the relationship between reason and faith, between humankind and God. Aristotle was read anew, no longer condemned as pagan, but embraced as the foundation on which Thomas Aquinas built his monumental Summa Theologica, the greatest wall of logic in medieval Christianity, an attempt to reconcile ancient wisdom with divine belief. Reason is the handmaid of faith. Outside the university gates was another world, noisy, practical, and full of life. Markets sprang up around cathedrals where Italian merchants sold fabrics and Eastern spices, and craftsmen forged iron-tanned leather, embroidered cloth, and fashion-stained glass. The cries of vendors mingled with the ringing of bells, the smell of fresh bread blended with candle wax, and in every alley something was stirring, a society learning to breathe as one living organism. Artisans formed guilds, setting rules, guarding quality, and passing their crafts to apprentices. From this, the urban middle class emerged a new force, neither noble nor peasant, but driven by the energy of innovation. If Romanesque and Gothic were the art of cathedrals, then the 13th century was when art stepped out into the streets. In Italy, painters like Giotto di Bondone began to paint real people faces that could feel joy, sorrow, and faith, laying the first stones of humanist Renaissance art. Music, too, transformed. From the solemn single-voiced chants of old came polyphony, many voices intertwined, heralding the birth of the European choir. And across the squares, troubadours, wandering poet-musicians sang of love, honor, and loneliness, bringing art from palaces to taverns and marketplaces. Nightly poems, murals, plays, and puppetry all merged into a symphony of earthly life. Art was no longer only for God, it was to tell the story of humankind. This was one of the rare moments in the Middle Ages when people truly believed in the order of the universe. The cosmos was seen as a perfect symphony, God, the conductor humankind, the notes in his divine composition. It was no longer an age of fear, but an age of harmony where every being had its sacred place. When sunlight passed through the stained glass windows, it did more than color the stone walls red and blue. It filled the human mind with the belief that beauty itself was proof of faith. The Gothic builders never called themselves artists. They were prayers in stone. Each bell tower reached upward, not to touch the clouds, but to lift the human soul from the earth. Each carved stone traced the imagined path to heaven. And in every gleaming pane and soaring arch, they told humanity's greatest story, that light can pierce the darkness if we learn to build windows. Romanesque was the steadfast faith of the earth. Gothic, the joyous faith of the sky. Romanesque knelt in darkness. Gothic rose in light. One was supplication, the other thanksgiving. Together, they formed the great hymn of a humanity learning to believe in itself. That is why it is said the Middle Ages were never dark. They were an era when humankind learned to redraw heaven with bare hands, with stone glass music and faith. Cathedrals were not merely houses of God, but mirrors reflecting the human longing to transcend. Beneath the earth they carved stone, above the sky they raised light, and between the two humankind found itself. If Byzantium was the golden glow of the past, then Gothic was the flame of hope, where stone could sing and light became prayer. But that same faith carried another desire, the yearning to journey outward, to reclaim the Holy Land, and to seek glory in the desert. When faith became a weapon, Europe was ready to march once more into the Crusades. By the 11th century, Jerusalem, the city of David, where Jesus was crucified and rose again, was in the hands of the Seljuk Muslims. To the Christians of Europe, it was not merely a city, but the very heart of their faith. Pilgrims had once walked from France, Italy, and England to the Holy Land to pray. But after the Seljuks took control, the pilgrimage routes grew perilous. Rumors spread across Europe. Christians were seized, beaten, barred from the Holy Sepulchre. And in the minds of the faithful, Jerusalem was no longer a place of peace, but a symbol of a faith profaned. In 1095, in the town of Clermont-France, Pope Urban II stood before thousands of clerics, knights, and peasants. His voice thundered, Deus vult, God wills it. He called upon all to take up arms to free Jerusalem from the infidel. Those who joined, he promised, would have all sins remitted and their souls saved. It was a promise both sacred and politically potent. All Europe trembled. From castles, churches, and humble villages, tens of thousands pinned the red cross, the crux, to their chests and set out for the east. It was not only a military campaign, it was a religious tempest, an unprecedented social movement. The armed went for glory, the poor for faith, and many because they had nothing left to lose. They walked thousands of miles across the snows of the Alps, the plains of Hungary, the deserts of Syria. There was no logistics, no reliable maps, only faith and hunger. Thousands died along the way. But in 1099, the first Crusaders reached Jerusalem. After a 40-day siege, they broke the gates, and on that fateful July morning, Jerusalem changed hands once more. When we entered the city, wrote the chronicler Raymond d'Aguilera, the blood reached up to our ankles. Faith had triumphed, but the price was a sea of blood. The Crusaders established 4 Christian states in the East Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. They built castles, minted coins, married locals. For a brief moment, Europe believed it had reclaimed the Holy Land for good. But while they quarreled over spoils, another name rose in the East: Saladin. Saladin was not only a warrior, but a symbol of tolerance and discipline. He united Egypt and Syria, defeated the Crusaders at Hattin, 1187, and retook Jerusalem. Yet, he did not take revenge. Instead of a bloodbath, he allowed Christians to depart in safety. There is no need of blood to prove faith, say Muslim chronicles, in recording his words. Jerusalem changed hands again, but this time the world learned a different lesson. Morality belongs not to religion, but to humanity. News of Jerusalem's fall shocked Europe. The continent's 3 most powerful kings, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, launched the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Frederick drowned en route. Philip returned home after disputes, and only Richard the Lionheart advanced toward Jerusalem. He fought with great courage, retook Acre, and won notable victories, but in the end was forced to sign a truce with Saladin. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, but Christians were permitted to make pilgrimage. Two enemies, two warriors, chose respect over annihilation. In 1204, the Pope called for a new campaign, but instead of marching to Jerusalem, the crusading host turned to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a Christian city. Driven by greed and Venetian merchants, they sacked their fellow Christians, burning homes, looting treasures, taking down crosses for their gold. It was the deepest wound in the history of Christendom. Faith was replaced by profit, and in the ashes of Hagia Sophia, the hope of unity between East and West was shattered forever. The later Crusades steadily lost meaning. There were fewer warriors and more merchants. In God's name, men seized lands, and pilgrimage became a trade in faith. In 1291, Acre fell. The last Crusader stronghold in the East collapsed. The dream of liberating Jerusalem officially ended. Yet from those ashes, the world had changed. The Crusades opened commerce between East and West spices, silks medicine, and Arabic learning, all flowed back into Europe. And in that current, the seeds of the Renaissance began to sprout. The Crusades were once called a holy war, but in truth, they were a mirror held up to the human soul. This sentence opens the central paradox, what was called a bellum sacrum. A holy war became the place where faith was most brutally tested. Europeans left home bearing the sign of the cross, the emblem of love and sacrifice. But when they reached Jerusalem, that emblem was stained with blood. Here the work uses the image of the mirror as metaphor. The Crusades were not only a historical event, but a reflection of human nature. As in a mirror, we see both faces, the light of ideals and the shadow of desire. Faith gave people a reason to act, but it also hid pride, ambition, and fear. Symbolically, the mirror runs throughout medieval Christian civilization, from the mirror of the sol speculum animi to the mirror of justus speculum e justitiae. Here the meaning is inverted. It no longer reflects the perfection of God, but the contradictions within humanity itself. It shows how great faith can be, and how terribly it can be deformed. This line does not condemn. It places faith within the span of human possibility. In its purity, faith is a spiritual force. It helped peasants endure poverty, sustained warriors through the desert, and carried Europe through the fragmentation after Rome. But faith, when co-opted by power, becomes a political tool. Popes, kings, and Venetian merchants all claimed God's will to justify their own designs. This is a modern ethical reflection. The narrative does not separate religion from humanity, but points out that the fall lies not in religion, but in how people use it. This is the most emotionally resonant turn in the chapter. After recounting the tragedy, cities burned, libraries, destroyed, families torn apart, the narrator does not end in despair, but offers an enlightening perspective. It evokes the paradox of progress. The price of expanding knowledge and cultural exchange was blood and tears. Before the Crusades, Europe was nearly closed off, its culture, bounded by Latin and the Church. After the Crusades, it confronted a wider world, the brilliant Muslim cities, the libraries of Baghdad, medicine, astronomy, and Greek philosophy, transmitted through Arabic translations. People set out to reclaim Jerusalem, but in the end, it was Jerusalem that taught them tolerance. When the drums of war fell silent, Europe brought back not just spoils, but a new way of seeing the world. From the pilgrimage roads, they learned to draw maps, to navigate by the stars, and to rewrite their own history through journeys. No one knew that scarcely 2 centuries later, that very spirit would push ships onto the oceans, ushering in the age of discovery. The Crusades ended, but the quest for the Holy Land within the human heart, the journey between darkness and light, goes on. After centuries of prosperity and light, Europe entered an age of famine, plague, and war, an age when prayers no longer seemed to reach heaven. The Great Famine, when the Holy Land ran out of bread. At the dawn of the 14th century, the climate turned suddenly colder. Harvests failed. Relentless rains rotted the wheat in granaries, and the fields of Europe, once its lifeblood, turned into seas of mud and despair. From 1315 to 1317, famine spread across the North England France, the Low Countries Scandinavia. People ate roots, oak bark, even the flesh of dead animals found by the roadside. Entire villages were abandoned. Parents sold their children for a few coins and still starved to death. Priests prayed for rain, but when the sky answered only with thunder, whispers spread among the people. Has God turned his face away? Then in 1347, a ship from Crimea docked at Messina, carrying goods and death. The Black Death swept through Europe like fire through dry grass. Within 6 years, over 1/3 of the continent's population was gone. In Florence, Paris, London, church bells tolled without end, and the living could no longer bury the dead. People called it the wrath of God. Flagellants clothed in sackcloth marched through the squares, whipping themselves and chanting, Miserere nobis Domine, have mercy on us, Lord. But the more they prayed, the quieter God became. The plague spared no one king or peasant monk or criminal. Corpses piled high in monasteries. Many priests fled. Many others lost their faith. When prayers no longer had meaning, humankind began to seek answers within themselves. A century of war when chivalry died in the mud. Amid this turmoil, 2 great powers, England and France, entered a conflict that would last more than 100 years, 1337 to 1453. Its causes were ambition bloodlines and national pride, but beneath them lay a deeper truth. It was the war of a world losing its old order. English archers, with their longbows, cut down armored knights once seen as invincible. At Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415, glittering cavalries fell into the mud, and the shining image of the medieval knight fell with them. Yet, amid the darkness, one small flame arose Joan of Arc, a 17-year-old peasant girl who said she heard the voice of God. She carried a white banner, led the French to lift the siege of Orléans, and made a dying nation believe in miracles again. But like all bright stars, Joan was consumed, burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. That fire did not only kill one woman, it burned away the last innocence of medieval Europe. Born of faith, she lived by faith, died for faith, and through faith France was reborn. The church divided, when heaven itself was split. If the Great Schism of 1054 had divided East from West, now the Western Church itself was breaking apart. In 1309, the Pope left Rome for Avignon in France under the control of King Philip IV. 7 popes ruled from there, far from the soul of Rome. The people called it the Babylonian captivity of the Church. When the papacy returned to Rome in 1377, a new disaster erupted, the Western Schism. 2, then 3 popes, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter. One in Rome, one in Avignon, one in Pisa, each offering salvation for a different price. Europe plunged into a crisis of faith. As priests quarreled over power, ordinary people began to ask, if even the popes cannot agree who speaks for God? The rise of nations, when power changed hands. From the ashes of the church and endless war, the first modern nations began to take shape. In France, the Valois kings unified the realm. In England, after the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, the Tudor dynasty rose, founding a centralized state. In Eastern Europe, Poland and Lithuania formed a prosperous union. Hungary became a power built on precious metals, and Moscow, having thrown off Mongol rule, proclaimed itself the Third Rome. The medieval world built on faith and bloodline was transforming into a world of law borders and national identity. Sacred authority was yielding to human power. God still ruled above, but the earth was no longer his alone. The awakening from darkness to understanding. After 2 centuries of hunger, disease, and blood, Europe emerged with new eyes. People no longer looked to the sky for miracles, they looked within themselves for meaning. Scholars like William of Ockham began to ask, can reason stand on its own without the shadow of faith? That question, small as it seemed, was the first seed of humanism. Out of doubt, people began to create. Out of despair, they found desire. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The last city of Rome was gone. But that same year in the West, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg perfected the movable type printing press. An old world was ending and a new one was beginning. Between 2 tolling bells, one for the death of Byzantium and one for the birth of knowledge, lay the sigh of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages did not die in a single night. They faded like the last candle in a church after Mass. When the plague had passed and the war subsided, people sowed seeds again upon the ruins. Where churches had collapsed, they built schools. And amid the ashes of fractured faith, a question rose. If God gave humanity reason, was it not so? We might understand his world. That was the moment Europe awoke from its long sleep of superstition. They had not abandoned God, they had begun to speak with him. Through the smoke of war, a door opened. Beyond it, the light of the Renaissance awaited. But to reach it, humankind first had to walk through the ruins of its own making. When the walls fell, in May of 1453, the Ottoman army under Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople, the final jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. For 53 days, colossal cannons thundered against the city walls until the Great Theodosian Wall, the symbol of 1,000 years of Rome, finally cracked. Emperor Constantine XI fell among his last soldiers. The crescent banner rose above the dome of Hagia Sophia. An empire that had endured for over a millennium vanished in a single morning. But that fall was not an end, it was the migration of knowledge. Byzantine scholars fled westward, carrying with them Greek manuscripts, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, seeking refuge in Venice, Florence, and Milan. And from the ashes of Constantinople, the flame of ancient learning was reignited on Italian soil, the press that changed the world. In those same years in Mainz, Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was fitting small lead letters into a wooden frame. He did not know that his invention, the movable type printing press, would transform humanity more than any army ever could. Before him, a single book required months to copy by hand. Now hundreds could be produced in days. For the first time in European history, knowledge was no longer the privilege of the church. The Bible was printed in local languages. Books on philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics spread across the continent. Those black-inked pages were like seeds scattered upon fields once soaked in blood. From letters cast in metal, humankind forged the freedom of thought. The birth of humanism. In the centuries before, learning had meaning only when it served theology. But now thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham began to ask, if reason is a gift from God, why should we not use it to understand his world? From that question, a new door opened. Science, long confined within monasteries, stepped into the light. Monks now looked to the heavens, not only to pray, but to measure the stars, calculate orbits, and uncover natural laws. Thus was born humanism, the belief that humankind was not a fallen creature to be pitied, but the living masterpiece of the Creator, capable of thinking, creating, and loving. Not only scholars changed, the powerful did too. The Medici family of Florence used their wealth to patronize art, believing that beauty itself was a form of faith. In his workshop, Leonardo da Vinci wrote backward in his notebooks, studying the human body as a perfect machine. Brunelleschi raised the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a feat once deemed impossible. Michelangelo carved David, the symbol of human strength, and Botticelli painted the birth of Venus, where Greek myth was reborn within the heart of Christianity. After centuries on its knees, Europe now stood upright and lifted its gaze. If God is the source of light, then humankind is the mirror that reflects it. Sailing beyond the known world, as painters redrew the human body, sailors began redrawing the world. From the ports of Lisbon and Seville, new ships like swift caravels sailed away from Europe's shores. Prince Henry the Navigator financed expeditions along Africa's coast, opening the path for Bartolomeo Diaz to round the Cape of Good Hope, 1488, and Vasco da Gama to reach India, 1498. Arab maps, Chinese compasses, and Islamic astronomy merged in the hands of European mariners, and they carried with them not only cargo, but an infinite hunger to understand. By faith they set out to find God. By knowledge they returned to find themselves. 1492, the meeting of stars. In 1492, history's constellations aligned. In Spain, after 700 years of struggle, the Christian kingdoms completed the Reconquista, capturing Granada and ending Muslim rule in Iberia. That same year, they sponsored a Genoese sailor, Christopher Columbus. In October, his ship, the Santa Maria, touched the shore of a land unknown to Europeans. None aboard realized they had crossed the boundary of the Old World. For the first time, Europe had set foot on the other hemisphere of the earth. A new era, the age of discovery, had begun. Between Florence and Granada, Mainz, and Lisbon, the threads of history wove together. On one side, intellect, on the other, exploration, and between them, humanity fragile yet boundless, the dawn after the long night. The so-called centuries of darkness were not a night at all, but a slow, luminous dawn, an age when humanity was still learning how to look into the light. From Rome's fall to the bloom of the Renaissance, those 10 centuries were a long lesson in being human, to believe, to doubt, to love, to create. The Middle Ages were never dark. They were only learning how to see the light. We leave behind the Gothic spires, rise through the clouds, and behold Europe from above, a continent that had endured 1,000 years of night, now glowing like a golden map. The narrator's voice softens almost like a benediction. From here, humanity will write its history anew, not with swords, but with knowledge. From here, light will no longer dwell only in churches, but in every mind brave enough to ask a question. Those 10 centuries, though very distant, still whisper to us today. They speak of faith and fear, of a deeply human longing to find light within darkness. As I reached the end of this journey, I gradually came to understand something both simple and difficult to accept. No age is ever completely dark, just as no human being is beyond change. Darkness is not the absence of meaning. Very often, it is merely the moment before meaning is reborn. From ruins, knowledge is born, not all at once, but fragment by fragment, carried forward by those who refuse to forget. From desolation, art rises again, not to erase pain, but to give pain a form so that it can be shared and understood. And from our questions, we learn how to believe again, not blindly, not desperately, but slowly through empathy and patience. Every civilization we have touched in this journey reminds us of one thing: collapse is not the end of the human story. Very often, it is the moment when a deeper human voice begins to speak. Perhaps this is why these historical stories still matter. Not because they give us certainty, but because they remind us that uncertainty has always been part of the human condition. Long before us, there were people standing amid ruins, looking into the unknown, who still chose to rebuild, without knowing how long the light they carried would last, knowing only that it was worth protecting. If this story caused you to slow down, even for a brief moment, to think, to breathe more deeply, or to see the world around you with a different kind of depth, I invite you to share that moment, what stayed with you the most. An idea, an image, a question, or perhaps just a feeling that is difficult to name. And if you feel comfortable, tell me this as well. What light have you found within your own darkness, whether in the past or in the present? You may also tell me where you are listening from and at what hour of the day or night. These journeys may be quiet, but they are not solitary. Every voice becomes a small point of light on the map we are drawing together. And if you would like to continue walking alongside me through stories of history, philosophy, and the human condition, remember to follow. Not to rush forward, but to move slowly together, one story at a time. Because every page of the past still illuminates the present, and each of us, in listening and remembering, becomes part of that enduring light. Before we close tonight's journey, I want to ask you one very small question. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? It may be in a room where the lights are already off. It may be on a late night journey. Or it may simply be a rare, quiet moment of your own when the whole world seems to have slowed down. If you wish, leave a line not to answer me, but to mark that you were here in this moment. I wish you a peaceful sleep. I wish that the remaining questions may be set down for tonight. And I hope that when you wake, a light, however small, will be there waiting for you.